Hi guys, so in this video we'll be discussing positive and normative economics. First of all, we'll go over the definitions and then we'll talk about what differentiates the two and then we'll look at a few examples. So the definition of positive economics is that positive economics is analysis that is strictly limited to either descriptive statements or economic predictions. So there are a few complex words being used in this example or this definition rather, and we'll look at what this exactly means. For now, let's move on to normative economics. So, normative economics is based on value judgments. So, what does value judgments really mean? So, basically, value judgments, there is a definition for that too. So, a value judgment is a judgment of righteousness or wrongness of something or someone based on a comparison. So, for example, let's say if we were to say that there is some guy who is poor, so if we back that fact up with only this reasoning that this guy is more poor or is poorer than some other guy, so that'll be a value judgment. It won't be based on some fact or figure. And if we were to say that some guy is actually poor, in that case, if you are backing that fact up with, let's say the figure which is used for poverty, which is I think $1.90 per day. So if that guy is actually earning less than $1.90 per day, then that's not a valid judgment because it's based on facts and figures. Okay, so now let's have a look at the differences between the two types of statements. So let's say if a statement is positive, then it will be based on economic theory, whereas a normative statement is not. We'll really understand what this means later on when we do the examples. The second difference is that positive statements can be tested, but normative statements cannot be tested. Basically, this means that something which can be tested or something that can be quantified is a positive statement as compared to something which cannot be quantified is a normative statement. The third one is a positive statement. Positive statements are basically objective, whereas normative statements are subjective. So this is more like how we understand this in English. So these are literal words, objective and subjective. So something is objective, which is not something which comes out of my own opinion. That will be a positive statement, and something which is basically my own opinion, something that I believe rather than what actually is the fact. That's going to be a subjective statement. So we'll really understand what these statements mean when we start doing the examples. So now let's look at this statement. The statement says unemployment is more harmful than inflation. So let's look at the three differentiating statements or the three differentiating rules which we have formed. The first one says that positive statements are based on economic theory. So never in economic theory have we ever heard this or have you ever gone through the fact that unemployment is more harmful than inflation. We have discussed that it can be more harmful, but that doesn't mean that it's always more harmful, right? And this statement doesn't really specify the boundaries of the statement itself. So that's why it's not a positive statement. Let's look at the second determining rule. The second rule says that positive statements can be tested. So in this case, we can't really measure whether it's more harmful or not. Because what does harmful really mean? Right? Because let's say even if we say that unemployment is harmful, it might not be harmful. It's not necessary that unemployment is harmful. So we can't measure its harmfulness as per se. And the third statement says that positive statements are objective and normative statements are subjective. So this is a subjective statement because I may feel that unemployment is more harmful and you might disagree with me. So there is a certain debate that can happen on this topic that whether it's more harmful or not, and then it also depends on the economic circumstances of the economy. So this is not always true, which is why it's going to be a normative statement and not a positive one. Now let's look at another example. In this case, the example says taxation is a weak tool in controlling inflation. So let's look at the first rule. Positive statements are based on economic theory. So never in economic theory did we discuss that taxation is a weak tool. We did discuss its disadvantages, but at the same time we also discussed its advantages. So we can't directly rule this out that it has no advantages at all and call it a weak tool. So this is why this will be a normative statement. if you feel that this does not make sense to you, then you can even use the second one. The second rule says that positive statements can be tested, but normative statements cannot be tested. So in this case, you can't really test whether this is a weak tool or not. I mean, what value will you assign? Let's say if there is a score of how strong or weak, which is obviously impossible, of how strong or weak taxation is, then what will be the value which you will assign for it to be considered a weak tool or a strong tool? And even to get to that point is impossible because you can't really assign values to the strongness or weakness or something, because obviously these words are subjective. Because let's say if taxation is strong for you, then it might just be weak for me. So this also fulfills the last rule, and so that's why this will obviously be considered as a normative statement. Now let's look at this third example. So this example says that unemployment below a certain level can cause inflation. So let's move on to the first rule. Positive statements are based on economic theory. So this one is true because we can really say, or we have studied this in economic theory, that let's say if the unemployment rate is a bit too low, and we'll discuss what too low really means in this case. If the unemployment rate is a bit too low, then it can cause inflation, because this will happen due to demand pull inflation. If unemployment is a bit too low, it's going to increase aggregate demand, and then obviously aggregate demand will cause, or may cause in this case, demand pull inflation. The second rule is that positive statements can be tested, but normative statements cannot be tested. So since unemployment has a certain value, because obviously we say that there is, let's say, 5% unemployment in this economy, so that's the ratio of people who are unemployed and the total labor force in that economy. So let's move on to the second one then. So the second rule says that positive statements can be tested, but normative statements cannot be tested. So in this case, we can test this value because we can quantify unemployment as a value as well as inflation. So both of these concepts have values assigned to them. For example, we can say that unemployment is 5% in a certain economy and inflation is 13% in that economy. So since we can use values, we can test these values as well. Now let's move on to the third one. So positive statements are objective and normative statements are subjective. So in so the reason why this rule is fulfilled as well is because in this case, I'm not using my own opinion. I'm not saying that this is what I believe, or you can't really argue upon this statement, since even though whatever you believe might be against what I believe, it doesn't matter in this case. Because there is a certain economic theory which is related to this concept, and that's what we all really believe in, and that's what we follow, rather than using our own theories or own thoughts or opinions in this case. And so we can't debate upon this topic because it's proven by economic theory.